Sarah Iannarone, thank you so much for joining us and talking to us during what is a very, very busy time for everybody, but you especially. Let's start with, I guess, the big question, which has been which I know you have been outspoken on a lot when it comes to like Twitter. So I kind of know, of course, where you stand on this, but just to see where you stand on it as of today when it comes to the federal involvement in trying to stop protests here in the city of Portland.
Well, no one in the city right now is happy about them being here. I walk down the street when I'm out walking my dog, and people are outside on their phones who you don't generally think they're not the ones with all the political signs in their yards. And you can hear them talking to their friends on the phone, to their neighbors across the fence. What are these feds doing in Portland? So this is something we can all agree on. We don't want them here. I think the problem that I have, and maybe what you're referring to, is, last week, the Portland Police union representative, was meeting with DHS Secretary Wolf. We know that Portland Police have been at least communicating with, if not cooperating with, Donald Trump's secret police, and really all of them have been acting without care for human life. And then the mayor of Portland goes on national TV on a circuit, really, washing out, I think, the last 50 or so days prior to the Fed's arrival of the fact that Portland Police Bureau were tear gassing Black Lives Matter demonstrators in the streets, that Portland police were arresting journalists and, labor and peace, ALCU representatives there legal advisors and ALCU representatives on the ground. And so you have to ask yourself, are they fighting over tactics or over turf? I mean, for Portlanders who've been out at these protests for a while now, my argument is we don't care which law enforcement is brutalizing us. Police brutality should not be the response to demonstrations about police brutality, period.
What about some of the moments that have really stood out during all of this? Just to point to a few, federal agent shooting a person in the face with a rubber bullet was one that really upset a lot of people. Then there was another moment where there were vehicles, there was officers in an unmarked van away from the Justice Center detaining a person who appeared to be protesting, putting them into a van and driving off. These are moments that the federal government has explained their side of things. But how do you feel now after hearing their explanation as to why they had an unmarked vehicle and things of that nature?
When you really pull out and look at this, our local policymakers need to be very clear about what we consider violence. We have people looking at the graffiti on that courthouse and calling it violence, calling us violent anarchists for essentially what some people have done is spray paint on a building. There's never any excuse for shooting, whether you call it a less lethal or more lethal munition, into the head, injuring one of our Portlanders. And I don't know that we're ever going to be able to rein in that behavior, but unequivocally on the part of our leadership should be zero tolerance for it. But again, how can we expect zero tolerance from the feds when we have not had zero tolerance with our own police bureau? These Gestapo-like tactics in a democracy, we talk about the right to assembly, the right to free speech, and we've had these conversations not just in the last 50 days or 60 days, but in the last 4 years since Trump's election, as we've been besieged by outside agitators who have come cloaked in these freedoms enshrined in the Constitution. We have not ever said, you're actually hijacking our Constitution, and now look at what's happening. The Constitution is being hijacked for Trump's political ambitions, and our policymakers are the ones who paved the way because they didn't shut that down soon enough. And that's one reason why I felt I needed to run this grassroots campaign, because I've been there with the neighbors saying there are not good people on both sides. These people are cloaking themselves in our Constitution, but they're here to sow violence. They're here to sow bigotry and hate in our city. And as a sanctuary city, we have to step above and beyond if we're going to say that we're a sanctuary city. So it's this notion of not accepting both sidesism, of really having zero tolerance for hate, violence in any form, and making sure that when we talk about violence, spray paint is distinguished from actually, harming people's lives and potentially inflicting serious injuries from which they may never recover, or even death is what I fear the most.
Do you think that categorizing the violence we're seeing from violent protesters with spray paint is minimalizing it? Shouldn't that stand alone from some of the other violent acts that we have seen, like setting fires, trying to set buildings on fire, attacking a federal officer with a hammer, injuring the eyes of officers with lasers? You mentioned the types of violence that are out there. They have doxed several officers by putting their public information online that could endanger their property, their personal property, or even their families.
Look, when we talk about violence, let's be very clear who experiences violence in this city prior to this occupation and prior to these Black Lives Matter protesters. We watched as our police bureau year over year has had their budgets increased while we see domestic violence survivors struggling to get the help we need. We see people experiencing homelessness, dying on our streets by the dozens annually. We saw over 50 traffic deaths on Portland streets last year. We lost my neighbor, Lou Batams, on Foster Road the day that they opened a new safety project. To me, that is the violence from which our community never recovers. And so you want to talk about spray paint on a federal building, or a young protester throwing a water bottle towards a law enforcement officer. I need to be very clear that we are going to distinguish between those two things. And in fact, we have talked before, you and I even, about the role of de-escalation so these protests aren't getting to these points. What I'm hearing from the people is that if we were defunding wasteful spending on militarized responses and actually putting the money into the community services that we know we're going to need, and this is not theoretical 4 years from now, we're looking 4 months from now as these human disasters in terms of hunger and homelessness are increasing, multiplying due to the COVID-related unemployment. This is not people talking about something down the road, budget cycle 2, 3, or 4 down the road. This is months from now that we need to shift these resources to critical services for people. So the real violence is very much about economic impacts and really who's losing their lives and how here. I have not seen the loss of life among the people who are occupying the city to the extent that I have seen it among my neighbors.
Certainly the bigger picture. I agree with you. But as far as what we're seeing night in and night out, the central focus, I think, of the people who at least immediately live around that area, and a lot of people in this city, state, and across the country, can we agree that the violence that we're seeing from protesters isn't just throwing bottles and spray painting? I mean, there are also other acts of violence. There's a video going around now where an officer was in the midst of detaining someone or arresting someone, and 3 or 4 protesters run over and tackle that officer and push him to the ground. Another officer comes to his aid and pulls his gun. I mean, that could have ended tragically. These are true violent acts, no?
But
I'm not defending
Gestapo,
one side or another.
No.
But
And I want to be clear, though, and the reason that we had just talked about Gestapo-like tactics from Trump's secret police, we are out there worried that our friends and neighbors are being swept up by a federal government from which we may never be able to recover these people again. Without us being able to even track who's taking these people and how, I can see why if you had a colleague of yours in the streets scooped up by these people, you would fight to grip them back and hold them here in our community. Now, ultimately, what we need to think about is what are we going to do to get onto the other side of this, right? You don't hear any plans of how we're going to get out of this. And again, I don't equate, young people setting newspapers on fire in a newspaper box the same as I equate what I was there and witnessed and experienced with a wall, hundreds of moms. We were down there facing that Justice Center because we know these are our young people behind us. My daughter is 20 years old. These are her friends, her classmates who are there. And we were tear gassed by the feds. That is the violence. You don't gas hundreds of American moms on U.S. soil with federal officers against people who are residing in our city, even if you don't like their behavior. That's not how you respond. This isn't how it should be happening in the United States of America in 2020.
Why do you refer to them as secret police when we know that they're with the U.S. Marshals and Border and Customs and other federal agencies?
Because the lack of ability to track who's doing what where, the lack of accountability about what's happening on the other side of this, the lack of any recourse for Portlanders to be able to account for what's happening. Have we found out who was flying that plane overhead in Portland? Have we found out who's collecting data on our protesters and not? Who's conducting surveillance? Who's actually doing these things? We know that transparency from the Trump administration is about zero. We know that their credibility is zero. They are not trusted by the public. So why would we even believe what they tell us? This is why we fight so hard, even for our local law enforcement, to have accountability and transparency and access in terms of public records and other things. We've had people asking, can we please make it easier to find out which officers are misbehaving? Why are they covering up their badge numbers and things like that? So if you don't have trust and you don't have accountability and transparency, they can tell us anything we want, but how do we actually know?
If you don't know, but you said that you are wondering if the people who are being arrested or detained, if you could ever recover these people again. Did you mean that you don't know if you'll ever be able to see them again, as if they'll be vanished somewhere with no paper trail? Is that what you're insinuating?
I'm saying that may be what the people in the streets are responding to when they see that activity. You had asked me about the people who were responding to the law enforcement officer and that potential arrest. And in that situation, I was trying to say this is what I would imagine was going through their head at the time.
Do you think that sounds extreme a little bit, to think that U.S. officials or U.S. officers would be detaining someone to never be seen again with no paper trail? Because we're in the process of recovering that type of information right now by trying to figure out the people who have been arrested and the what they're being charged with, how long they were detained. There's information that we're recovering now on those people.
I think you can look at the situation at our border in terms of disappearing people under the Trump administration and not call it extreme to say that we do not trust this administration when it comes to accountability and reliability and how we're going to be able to follow up. If that does become something that we can rely on and depend on, and the American public trusts in this administration again and believes that they're acting above board, then we move forward from there. But to this point, what we are seeing in this United States of America is an administration that's completely corrupt and in which the American people do not trust. So I think asking demonstrators in the street when they have the federal government here occupying our city against our will, we've asked them not to be here. I mean, as much as I disagree with how long it took Ted Wheeler to get there, pretty much every elected official now is saying, we don't want you here, you can leave now, and they don't. Why should we trust that they have our best interests? Why should we trust that we're going to be able to rely on even paperwork or data or any information that they do give us? That is my point, that when trust is broken, it doesn't matter what they provide you. What do you believe?
Well, I hope that we believe that they're not whisking people away to never be seen again or to vanish off the face of the earth, people who are citizens of this city or of this state or of this country or people in general. I hope that we still have. I still hope we have enough trust in our infrastructure and the people who are in law enforcement that we wouldn't think that could happen.
I don't think the folks at the Justice Center really have that trust, though, and that's my biggest concern, and that's probably why they're protesting, because without that trust, I don't know that they have any other anything else to hold on to, really.
So what we mentioned kind of the resolution or how this will all come to an end. What do you think can be done? How do you think that we do find peace and are able to move forward in a way that doesn't involve these types of protests, but other action?
This is one reason why I focused so much of my campaign, which is now on track to break city records for the most number of donors in a local election, on accountability and transparency and open access in terms of who is funding my campaign and how that will be accessible to the public. You can track it right down to a map and see parts of the city that are contributing to my campaign. You look at the incumbent and the fact that he's broken campaign finance regulation after campaign finance regulation, and the lack of trust there. The fact that he comes out late when it's in terms of policy solutions or even responses that the public wants. He waits and waits and waits until the pressure is so strong that he can no longer resist, and then he co-opts it as if it was his idea. Without trust in government, we are sunk. Democracy is based on it. It's why we need journalists, so they can put light on things that may not otherwise come to light. It's why we need inclusive democracy and elections that are accountable and reliable and inclusive. It's why we need to make sure that our elected officials are holding themselves to the highest standards. So having a mayor in office who will be open, accountable, and transparent is going to be key so that we don't get ourselves into these situations. On my website at sarah2020.com, I proposed a good government plan that at one point felt like the least sexy thing on my website compared to some of the other more popular things like a Green New Deal and housing for all. But when you look at the situation that we're in today, basics like making sure our local government is inclusive, accountable, and transparent are going to be at the foundation of all of these things we're trying to solve, whether it's police reform, climate change, or housing. Our people need to start believing in our local government and feeling like their voice matters and that they can shape outcomes when they're not happy about how it's going.
Mayor Wheeler's going down to the protest tonight. What's your take on that?
Well, welcome aboard, Ted. We'll be happy to see you. A lot of us have been out in these streets for a very long time, and we have long felt that if our elected officials were standing beside us, especially when it was the Portland police and Mayor Wheeler is their boss, that it would be less likely that they would use excessive force against us. I'm not sure what kind of response the feds are going to have to him. I hope that he comes out safe, and I hope that everyone comes out safe tonight.
Quickly before we wrap things up, it appears that Teresa Rayford is going to be running as a write-in candidate. I've been getting a bunch of her supporters sending information my way. And of course, with the mayoral election being a little farther off and so many other things to focus on, we haven't gotten heavily into that coverage. But I was wondering what you think moving forward about her running in this election and if that endangers some of the votes that you were hoping to get.
We just held a primary. 92% of the voters in that primary went a different direction from her. The mandate was clear. Over half of the voters didn't support Ted Wheeler. I feel compelled to honor the people who voted for me and put me into the primary. And there are going to be two names on the ballot this November, mine and Ted Wheeler's, no matter what happens. So ultimately, right now, Portlanders need to come together to make sure that if we're not supportive of the incumbent, that we get him out. My campaign is built on positivity. I've put a lot of time and effort into running a grassroots campaign. And in fact, the COVID recovery plans, the housing recovery plans, the transition to a just economy are central in why people supported me. I've got very comprehensive plans that have been informed by community with practical implementation pathways. And my track record of understanding how the various sectors work together, whether it's small business, community, higher education, even internationally, how we'll function with other cities is going to be key. I believe I'm the best candidate for mayor, and I hope that people will consider giving me their vote in November.
Sarah Iannarone, thank you so much for your time, as always.
Thanks for having me. Bye-bye.